Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the learning series around the European Union regulation on deforestation-free products. So my name is Greta Ellero, and I'm a Program Coordination Associate Officer at the United Nations Development Program, the Food and Agricultural Commodity Systems team, and I will be one of the moderators of today's session, together with my colleague Matthew McFall, Senior Private Sector Advisor. Please feel free to introduce yourself as well in the chat. Let me start with some technical aspects. So the workshop is recorded, and the recording with all the presentations and also other useful resources will be shared with you after the end of the workshop, so don't worry about that. Spanish interpretation is also available. My colleague Federica will post interpretation instructions now in the chat. Feel free to ask questions, put comments in the chat. You are more than welcome to do that. And so now I would like to start with a quick framing. The learning series is organized by our FACS community, and UNDP, as you might know, works in more than 170 countries with governments, with the private sector, and also other key stakeholders to shift to a new paradigm for food and agricultural commodity systems based on diversified, resilient, and agroecological systems and value chains, which work simultaneously on achieving economic, environmental, social, and health outcomes, with smallholders central to the transformation as the engine of economic development. So the learning series seeks to be really a space for you as a practitioners in this field, really to bring and to hear your concerns on implementation of the regulation, and also to share practical examples to show what is already available. In fact, a few days ago, I was attending another super interesting roundtable of around the regulation, and the representative from the European Commission was precisely mentioning this. The regulation has a lot of aspects to be discussed, and includes different supply chains, involves different supply chains. So these kind of events are really valuable for all of us. It's a lot about sharing practices, examples of work, solutions, and as I mentioned, there is already a lot out there that we should know and we can learn from each other. So now the agenda of today is we will start with a framing from our colleagues from the Preferred by Nature. We will hear about what are the key points to remember about traceability. This is the topic of today's session across different commodities. What are the challenges for different sectors? What tools and systems are available for companies that to know and to use, and what companies can do to prepare. Then we will move to the field, and we will hear a very interesting case study from WRI and the World Cocoa Foundation from the cocoa sector. Then we will have another interesting session from Trace on supply chain traceability systems. And then we will move to the moderated exchange part, where we really want to give the space to all of you to intervene, to ask your questions, and to make your contribution to the session as well. We will then wrap up and close the session. So now, without further ado, I would like to leave the floor to Preferred by Nature to give us a quick framing. Thank you very much. And Chloe, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Rita. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Down, image on, or?
It is, can you put it in the presentation mode, please?
Yes.
Because.
Okay, display setting. Is it better?
Yes, perfect, okay. Thank you.
Wonderful. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chloe from Preferred by Nature, and we've kindly been invited by UNDP FACS to kick off this session with a broad picture of the traceability requirements from the EU Deforestation Regulation. So I'll try to set the scene a bit more generically before you can hear from the next guest speakers with more concrete and specific case studies. So just a quick word about ourselves. If you don't know us already, we're a mission-based, not-for-profit organization. We're global. Our headquarters is in Denmark, but we're really international. I'm based in France. So I'm a responsible sourcing specialist and also heading our traceability cross-division program. We're doing a little bit of different things. So you might know us for different aspects of our work. So very quickly, one, we are a big certification body. So we're accredited to the main sustainability certification schemes, FSC, RSPO, Rainforest Alliance, etc. We also implement donor-funded projects, especially in producing countries at the land use level. We also provide tailored services to the private sector in their responsible sourcing activities. And we also strive to develop and publish free and open source tools, guidance, and advice to practitioners and train. We do a lot of webinars and things like that. So really, in a nutshell, that's who we are, and that's why we've been kindly invited to start this presentation. So I'll do two things in the 10 minutes I have. First, I will remind everyone and drill a little bit down on what are the requirements that are actually in the EUDR, which are linking to traceability. And then I'll touch base on a couple of points, as Greta mentioned, in terms of what it means in practice and the tools that might be available and the steps that might be needed to take for those who will be impacted by those regulations. So if any of you have read this regulation, you might notice that the word traceability is not really mentioned as such, and the regulation is not saying you need to do traceability and you need to map your supply chains and know your suppliers. So it's kind of like an inferred obligation or activity that's really deriving from this one article here, which is Article 9, which is listing all the information requirements that operators will need to collect and have available when they're exporting products from the EU market, importing in the EU market, or placing on the markets commodities which might be produced in the EU itself. So for the sake of simplicity, for the rest of my presentation, I might just say import into the EU market, because that's kind of the most challenging part, but just keep in mind that there's other situations of exporting and placing on the market that are also concerned by this. So what do we have here? There's 2 bullet points. It's really short, but it has quite far-reaching implication, actually. So it says that, that operators need to collect information on the country of production of the commodities, so where agricultural commodities are grown or where cattle is raised, and geolocation of all plots of land where they have been produced, as well as date and time range of production. So let's drill a little bit into those 2 bullet points. One thing to mention that's quite important is that there's some specification clarification on geolocation. It means different things depending on the size of the plot of land. So that might be a reminder for some of you, but worth mentioning, if the agricultural or forest plots are less than 4 hectares, 1 point will be enough in terms of geolocation. And 1 point means some digits to identify a latitude, some digits to identify longitude, and their kind of intersection will give you a point on the surface of the Earth. And for all plots that are above 4 hectares, then you will need to have a collection of several plots that together will form a perimeter or a polygon. So we're keeping that in mind. There's this bit of a differentiation. Obviously, it goes without saying that if those commodity are aggregated along the supply chain when the products are being processed in the supply chains, then those geolocation information will need to be aggregated accordingly, so that in the end, when you're placing a product in the market, you can match it to a list of specific origins. And last but not least, worth remembering that the data and time range of production, so that kind of time-based information, is a whole layer in itself, right? It's not totally the same as collecting geolocation information. There's not so many details on the maximum time range of production, for instance, that's available so far. So there's a bit of a blind spot on how it will be implemented in practice, but it's really important to keep that in mind, that it's a challenging bit in itself. And finally, the regulation is also saying, that's really important, that those 3 elements, the country of production, the geolocation of the plots of land, and the time-based information, they will need to be included in the due diligence statements, submitted and made available by operators in the online information systems by operators, right? So it's not something to take lightly, because there will be declaration every single time operators will fill a due diligence statement. They will need to take this data from their systems and make it available. So that's in a nutshell what the regulation is saying. It's not saying so much more than that. So that leads me to say a few words on what it means in practice and key solutions that are out there. Now, I want to start by saying that each type of supply chain, each type of commodity, each industry might need slightly different systems, slightly different setups, slightly different tools. So there's not one magical formula for all, but I will try to share a few insights that will be generally applicable to everyone. The first thing I want to mention is that it's very important to have appropriate digital traceability systems in place. What the regulation is asking to connect operators to lists of plots of land of production. That cannot happen first without a solid level of supply chain mapping. That means that operators need to know the whole of their supply chain. It's not directly a requirement, but it's an indirect requirement. There's no way that an operator can have confidence and say, my product is coming from these, let's say, these 10 farms, if they have not connected all the dots between the farms and themselves. So there's this supply chain mapping exercise, which is challenging in itself, and it's requiring a high level of transparency that might be uncomfortable for some. It's requiring to engage with all the suppliers in the supply chain, including indirect and faraway suppliers. And finally, collecting this information, then you also need to handle it properly. So that means having appropriate digital tools to store this information and manage it. No, again, not the same for everyone, but unless an operator has a very, very, very simple operation, usually what they need will be some form of database or relational database, which will allow them. It's the kind of software that allows to have complex and long records and to match records against each other. So matching producers to supply chains, to transactions, to products, to components, etc. There's a lot to it to explore in terms of what kind of database are out there. Some can be developed in-house, some other types of database like enterprise resources database can be kind of tailored to target supply chain management and traceability. Some other digital service providers are actually right now developing specific tools to address those supply chain mapping and traceability requirements. So there's a lot of options out there. What's really important is to think about the features that are needed to get to what you need to be doing, which is for the EUDR, this geolocation requirement and the time-based information collection for all your products. Right, so it's about what is recorded, how it is being recorded, who's participating in the system, and how the system is going to be set up and deployed. So we could be talking about that for a whole day, I think. So just to mention that it's a very important step not to be overlooked. Very quickly, because my time is running out, I just wanted to say a few things on certification and traceability, because it's quite important. Certification is a very useful tool to comply with EUDR requirement, especially when it comes to legality and zero deforestation. It's so far not so well suited to address the geolocation and time-based requirements. Almost none of the certification systems are already providing this information for several reasons. I'm not going to get into those details. Just remember that they can evolve, they can be adjusted, and some of the COC models will be more easily to adjust to fit these needs, and it will likely need some push from certificate holders and industries to make those certification schemes able to provide you this information, but it's possible. A few words on geolocation information. This regulation means that everyone along the supply chain will need to upgrade their GIS skills. GIS data, as I have just said, is not easy data. It's not just a piece of text like the name of a supply chain entity. It comes with digits, latitude, longitude. There's a ton of different formats available out there. There's a collection process that needs to be set up. If you have a large supply base, including smallholders, the collection process needs to be set up carefully, and it will not happen without the implication of the operators in the EU market, but also with the strong implication of those who are closer to the producers. So that's really a collective effort that needs to be organized. And then there needs to be some alignment on how to format the data, how to organize it, how to aggregate it, and how to communicate it. If that's a topic of interest for you, we are launching right now a small project with FAO trying to propose a kind of common protocol to guide the adjustment of digital systems to specifically for transferring geolocation data. So do not hesitate to reach out to me if you're interested, and we're hoping to put forward a useful tools for everyone to use and upgrade their systems. And I will just conclude by saying that, again, like kind of stressing that the time-based information requirement is going to be really difficult for some industries to comply with, because the information is not static, it's going to change all the time. So it is very likely, maybe not 100% of the case, but it's very likely that it will require traceability systems that allow this information to travel in a source forward way alongside with products and batches of products, which is a very, very specific types of traceability system. With that, I hope you are not completely freaked out if you're an operator and if you're impacted with that. A few steps for you to follow if you feel this is going to be a huge challenge. Very important for any operator to assess their current systems, what's their current level of supply chain mapping, their current tools and processes. Try to figure out how you will develop or upgrade the digital tools you're using to reach compliance. Engaging with supplier is very important, even if not engaging with buyers, if not engaging across supply chain, across industries to lower the costs and make this more practical, this exercise more practical. There's a lot of pilots out there, so there's definitely lesson learned and best practice to pull from whoever's already run existing pilots and initiatives, etc., including across commodities. And last but not least, it's very important also to keep in mind that integrity measures need to ensure data quality so that the data you feed into the systems are as strong as the system itself, and you don't end up with this kind of garbage in, garbage out scenario. And once you've done all that, then that's actually when you can start assessing legality and zero deforestation. So that's a bit of a quick journey to it. I will stop there. I hope it's been a quick and informative setup of the scene. If I can take 20 more seconds, I don't know, I haven't had a chance to look at the audience. If any of you is in Germany or around Germany, we have an in-person event next week in Berlin on the EUDR. It's free and open. You just need to come to us. So if you're interested, you can reach out to me and register. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chloe. That was really interesting. And so now we move into the field, and we will be hearing about a case study, a collective action and data sharing case study from the World Resources Institute, and the World Cocoa Foundation. Please, Ethan and Caroline, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Can you see my screen and can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and also see your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Ethan Budiansky. I am the Senior Director of Environment at the World Cocoa Foundation. I'm collaborating here today with Caroline Winchester of WRI, but I'll leave her to introduce herself later in this presentation. But let me start by framing the conversation today. We were asked to present on a specific collaboration that WRI and WCF is working on together towards collective action and data sharing. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor as to who we are, the World Cocoa Foundation, we are an NGO. We're based in DC. We've got offices in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and we are driving sustainability in the cocoa sector, focusing on farmer income, on tackling child labor and forced labor, and then, of course, eliminating deforestation and restoring degraded forest in the cocoa supply chain. We do this by convening our membership, which is made up of the private sector, engaging directly with producing and consuming governments, resource mobilization, driving best practices, communication, and working on policy engagement, such as the EUDR as well. We have about 100 cocoa and chocolate companies from around the world who are members of the World Cocoa Foundation. They represent about 85% of the entire cocoa supply chain. You'll see a number of suppliers and manufacturers who you are already very familiar with in this list. Now, in 2017, we launched the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. This is a collaboration between the governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire with the cocoa and chocolate industry, and also in partnership with IDH, towards a collaboration to eliminate deforestation in the cocoa supply chain and restore degraded lands. It was initially launched in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and then further expanded into Colombia. We have 35 companies who are members of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, who are making investments and putting forward and delivering on their commitments towards tackling deforestation. The Cocoa and Forest Initiative, or CFI, is an unprecedented collaboration, an unprecedented initiative. I mean, first and foremost, by far, where it is transforming the sector to have a much stronger focus on the issues around deforestation, climate change, and overall environmental sustainability. CFI is also promoting transparency and accountability. And on that note, for everyone who's on the call right now, I want to point you to the fact that all of those 35 companies are now in the process of publishing their 2022 progress reports of all of the commitments and activities that they've been doing over the past year. They're also putting forward their action plans in the public space that's going to lay out their targets and commitments to 2025. We're establishing stronger collaboration, and that means collaboration across the industry, and also collaboration, of course, with the producing governments and with other key stakeholders in country. We're promoting collective action and data sharing, and that's what we're talking about today, so we'll dive deeper into that. And then aligning on best practices and quality M&E. Now, what's key about CFI is that there's through this collaboration between industry and government, is that there's a good understanding of roles and responsibilities and coordination and collaboration within that. With the government focusing on putting forth those enabling conditions around forest policies and guidance, working on national level traceability, which is obviously very relevant for our work on and alignment with the EUDR. Boundary mapping, putting forth standards as well. With the companies focused on making those investments on the ground level around traceability, in particular within their direct supply chains. Investments in cocoa agroforestry, farmer training, restoration, reforestation, as well as many other actions. Now, since the launch of CFI, we've had a lot of success in making good on the targets and commitments put forth by companies and by the governments as well, though I'm going to focus on the companies right now. These numbers that I'm presenting to you are from last year's report, and that's only because the companies are currently finalizing their 2022 progress reports, and those are all being made public right now. But in what we see is that the companies have made a lot of progress in improving traceability within their direct supply chains that incorporates unique farmer IDs. Each of the farms are actually polygon mapped as opposed to just geolocation. And companies are using that information to effectively trace and track the cocoa that they're buying. They're also making significant investments towards the promotion of cocoa agroforestry and off-farm restoration, distributing over 23 million trees as of last year, as well as significant work in farmer training on good agricultural practices, as well as climate smart cocoa. As we look into the next phase of the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, what we're referring to as CFI 2.0, which will take us to 2025. Our focus is on how can we accelerate and scale impact on the ground. So in alignment with the 35 companies who are all signatories of CFI, moving forward, what we are focused on doing is, and then obviously in collaboration with the governments and other stakeholders as well, we're focused on scaling public-private collective action to conserve forests and restore degraded landscapes. We'll talk more about that in a second. And a foundation of that is improving and promoting greater data sharing within these landscapes and even outside, scaling up cocoa agroforestry, climate smart cocoa, and other key activities, and aligning that with national level and also company level carbon commitments. Advancing our alignment with the EUDR regulations, and that means at the company level within their own traceability systems, at the national level, aligning with national level traceability, and then working towards establishing deforestation-free cocoa landscapes. And then ideally expanding the Cocoa and Forest Initiative to other geographies beyond Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Colombia. For the past year and a half, we have been working closely with the companies and with the governments of Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire towards building public-private collaboration and collective action towards establishing deforestation-free cocoa landscapes that are focused on conserving remaining forest areas and then restoring degraded lands with off-farm restoration as well as through cocoa agroforestry. In both Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, we've done a lot of initial work with the governments to identify priority landscapes that we want to initially focus on. In the case of Ghana, focusing on the 6 hotspot intervention areas in alignment with the government. And then in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, identifying priority landscapes that are both a priority for the government and then for opportunities for restoration and conservation. Now, with that information in mind, looking within those priority landscapes and outside of the priority landscapes, that's where we built a collaboration with the World Resources Institute to develop the data set and the DRA to further help us with the prioritization, coordination, and driving collective action. So with that, over to you, Caroline.
Great. Thanks so much, Ethan. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending where you're sitting. My name is Caroline Winchester, and I am our Senior Manager for Responsible Supply Chains within the World Resources Institute. And it's my pleasure to now kind of deep dive into what Ethan just alluded to. So I'll be speaking to using the power of data, and specifically traceability data, to drive both collective action and the realization of further traceability data. So I think this is a really great example of how companies and other stakeholders can come together to both tackle deforestation and also gain insights on where it's happening to be able to demonstrate that they're deforestation free. So what this project consisted of was, as Ethan mentioned, a collaboration between the World Cocoa Foundation, the World Resources Institute, and 19 of those Cocoa and Forest Initiative companies. These actors came together about 2 years ago now. This project kicked up to come together and agree on the development of a comprehensive data set of cocoa plot locations within companies' direct supply chains, as well as an aligned method for assessing the risk of cocoa-driven deforestation across the cocoa belt of West Africa. And to make this partnership and this project a reality, these companies actually contributed over 1 million farm polygons to the process. And this was truly unprecedented. So I'm going to get into some of the details here of exactly what these data outputs were that were developed and how they were used to drive collective action and drive further transparent monitoring. So Ethan, if you could move to the next slide. Excellent. So as I mentioned, this data that companies submitted was used to develop 2 data output products. So the first was what we call the West Africa Cocoa Data Set. What this is a comprehensive view of all cocoa plots, so in this case, polygons, of participating companies' direct supply chains. And that's what amounted to over 1 million plots, as I previously mentioned. This data was used as the basis for identifying opportunities for collaboration across West Africa. And when we paired this data with the deforestation risk assessment, which I'll touch on in a second here, we're able to actually drive this collective action in the places that need it most. So basically in the places that are experiencing the most cocoa-driven deforestation. And this data set is also very key because it's supporting monitoring. It's actually allowed us to understand where companies have identified and collected farm boundary data and where they haven't. So areas where they need to keep doubling down their efforts to continue collecting traceability data. It's also being deployed to improve existing cocoa extent maps. So for example, this data set has been shared with the Joint Research Center of the EU as they are developing some more robust and public-facing cocoa extent maps to enable credible deforestation monitoring. And an anonymized version of this will be freely accessible as well. Now, the second data product that was developed through this project was a harmonized deforestation risk assessment methodology, which I'll hereafter refer to as the DRA. So what this is an agreed approach for identifying the risk of cocoa-driven deforestation so that everyone everywhere agrees on what that is and can then focus their efforts and engagement activities in the places that need it most in a harmonized fashion. And this is key because prior to this project, there were probably 8 or 9 different DRA methods floating about, and you can imagine what was happening. You know, one method was identifying one landscape as green and good to go. Another one was identifying the same landscape as red and problematic. But when they're not in agreement, we're all kind of focusing our efforts in a scattered, non-collective approach. So we developed this agreed upon method. It can be used at multiple levels of traceability and will be available as a freely accessible public good for all stakeholders interested in accessing it. Ethan, next slide. So I did want to just for a second get into a bit of the nitty-gritty of how this project came to be, because I think there's some interesting challenges and lessons learned here that I'll touch on later. But as you can imagine, sharing this level of traceability data was no small feat, right? You know, companies and other, have spent lots of resources and time to collect this data. In general, all stakeholders don't like to share data. This is just a fact, right? This is a reality of the world we live in. So building the trust to share the data and see the benefits of sharing it was a big part of this project. And so to effectively move this project ahead, we had to develop a data sharing agreement, which outlines the roles and responsibilities of WCF, WRI, and the 19 companies on exactly what data they were required to share, what would be done with it, how it would be made public, et cetera, et cetera. And there's just an excerpt of the agreement that I can say everyone signed the same exact agreement. This took about a year of negotiations, so just in context, but we got over the finish line. And then the second bit, which actually Chloe kind of touched on in her presentation, was we developed a data sharing protocol. So a protocol specifying in excruciating detail exactly what data companies needed to submit in what format, and then how we are going to clean this data, transform it, store, and share it. And this protocol is now being used by the cocoa sector as they collect new data to have it be collected according to a streamlined protocol. Because to be honest, when we received the data, it was messy, right? There were errors and it was all over the place. So if we can avoid that in the future, it will be helpful. Next slide, Ethan. And then these are the outputs, I think just worth mentioning, right? There's a lot you can do with data, traceability data, to drive positive change. So just as a snapshot, we developed 4 different data sets, or versions of the same data set, so to speak. I think the most relevant ones to highlight here is we had a version that had all the company's data packaged together as the basis for driving collective action, which the World Cocoa Foundation is now doing with these 19 companies. We also have what we call the Cocoa and Forest Initiative version, which is, again, an aggregated version of this data set, but anonymized, that was shared back with all contributing companies. So this actually was a way to help them get access to further traceability data that they didn't have to go collect themselves and waste resources to do so, right? So this was kind of a helpful way to increase traceability data amongst the companies. And this data set is also being used as training data for more robust cocoa extent maps and deforestation monitoring in general. So for example, this is what was shared with the Joint Research Center. And finally, there's a public version coming out of this data set to support everyone everywhere with better understanding where cocoa is a driver of deforestation. But this public version is actually going to blur out the exact locations of cocoa farms so that we're being mindful of the farmers that live right next to their farms and protecting their safety and livelihoods. So I'm going to circle back to that one too, because often we forget about farmers when we're talking about traceability data. Next slide. And here's just a fun snapshot of that deforestation risk assessment. It's under review as we speak and will be published in the next month or two here. But again, here's where the power of data can really help us in a harmonized fashion understand where we need to prioritize our efforts the most. And in this case, where are the areas that are most likely to experience cocoa-driven deforestation? All right, so then just to wrap this all up, some challenges and opportunities. So WCF and I kind of banged our heads together and came up with this list, and each bullet point is both a challenge and an opportunity that we wanted to highlight. So the first is that, as I already touched on, these sorts of projects are challenging in the fact that you do have to build trust, common understanding, and you do have to share data for them to work. And that's hard, but there are opportunities, right? We've, through this project, shown that it's possible. It's about making sure that everyone understands the goals of the project, is comfortable with that, and that it's detailed very specifically what's being done with this data to what end. So that's an opportunity. Another challenge and opportunity is that we do need an aligned strategy for collecting streamlined traceability data. Again, Chloe hit on this point in her presentation, but the data, received through this project was in all different shapes, sizes, formats with different errors and that sort of thing. So the more we can do to have standardized protocols for collecting traceability data and sharing it, the more efficient it's going to be and the better we're going to have this traceability data and faster. So I think that's an opportunity. And then in this project, right, we were collecting data in the direct supply chain, but we need to also figure out where traceability data is in the indirect supply chain. So I think an opportunity is through this project, we were able to see on a map where there was missing information in large portions across West Africa in terms of traceability data to help companies and other stakeholders say, okay, these are the areas where I need to double down my efforts to continue collecting this traceability data. So I think that's an opportunity. Another challenge and opportunity is once it comes to actually implementing these projects in the field, it's definitely going to require a multi-stakeholder approach, including governments, companies, smallholders, and everyone else. So again, it's great. We've seen the CFI and these companies come together. So it's an opportunity, but there will be some challenges along the way to effectively doing this. Two more, improved widely accessible access to cocoa-driven deforestation monitoring. So I will say that this is a challenge, I think writ large for the UDR, we have to be able to demonstrate that we're deforestation free, which means we need access to good data. There is some data out there. This project helped move the needle in the right direction towards contributing to better data to serve this purpose. But we have more work to do here in making sure everyone has access to the data they need to demonstrate deforestation free. And then importantly, and I want to emphasize this point really strongly, is we need to make sure that we're supporting smallholders to supply deforestation-free cocoa while ensuring their livelihoods are safeguarded. So this is both a challenge and opportunity. When we're handling traceability data, especially with supply chains like cocoa or coffee, we're talking about a polygon that's right next to the home of a smallholder. We always need to keep that in mind and how we handle that data, how we share it, how we store it, data privacy laws, and the ethics around that. So I do want to there's one thing you take away from my presentation, I want to emphasize that. And so we had to take special precautions throughout this project to be very mindful of this and be good ethical data stewards. And then finally, there's no resourcing needed if we're going to do these types of landscape projects. It takes a lot, right, to convene all these stakeholders and to handle and share the data. So if we're serious about tackling deforestation at scale and supporting smallholders to be part of the solution, we need to have donors and others step up to help push these along. And the final call to action is, writ large, we do need to really scale up these multi-stakeholder approaches. By working together, we can do more at much larger scales and much more efficiently. So that wraps up, I think, our presentation. Thanks for having us today, and we're looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Ethan and Caroline. Actually, there is a question from Paolo to you, Caroline. He's asking have you engaged the European Commission to take into account the harmonized DRA methodology you are developing in the European Commission's risk assessment of countries or part of countries, high standard law as part of the EUDR?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't in depth yet, but it's certainly something that I think would be a good approach if they're especially going to do it by municipality or jurisdiction. This could be a good basis for that, especially in West Africa, because we do have aligned agreement, not just amongst the companies, but we also got feedback from other service providers and other stakeholders as we were developing the DRA. So that's a great point. Thanks for flagging.
Good. Also, thank you, Paolo and Marcelo, for the questions that you posed before to Chloe. She's answering now in the chat. Feel free to ask any other questions that you may have in the chat, or just raise your hand. Also, Federica, if you can help me if there are any hands up, just let me know. So now let us move, let us turn to Trace and who they are going to present their supply chain traceability systems and tools. Andre, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Greta, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. We'll just share my screen quickly. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen and then you can hear me well?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Great. So my name is Andre Vasconcelos. I'm the Global Engagement Lead of Trace. I think this presentation nicely builds up on what Caroline and Ethan just mentioned and I'm going to bring here how transparency, data, and insights can help to support deforestation-free supply chains using the lens of the EU regulation mostly. So just to mention briefly what is TRACE, it is a data-driven transparency initiative that maps the international trade and finance of agriculture commodities that are linked to deforestation in tropical areas. So it's basically an initiative built by two organizations, the Stockholm Environment Institute, based in Sweden, and Global Canopy, which is an NGO based here in Oxford, where I'm speaking from in the UK. And the ultimate goal really is how can we support companies, financial institutions, and also governments to really, understand where they are sourcing from by increasing transparency in these very complex and opaque supply chains, and really break the complexity to enable actions, while at the same time really bringing transparency to hold accountable companies and consumer governments to the risks that they are exposed to. So just to mention, I mean, we map the mid part of the supply chain, so linking countries of import all the way back to municipalities or production regions where they are mostly produced. So I just wanted to quickly show here a quick demo of one of the tools that we have in the platform. And I bring here an example of soybeans exports from Brazil. So what we are looking here, it's a comprehensive mapping of all the soy production in Brazil, the soy production area, and all the soy exports from Brazil. So from the municipalities where it was produced, naming the exporting companies, the importers, and all the economic blocks or countries of destination. So if we click here, for example, if we're interested in one company and we click here, we can see where this company is likely sourcing their soy from. We can do this for different companies and see their sourcing areas. Or we can also do that for certain economic blocks or countries of imports. So we can see here, for example, where the soy imports into Europe from Brazil is coming from. So I'm just going to expand here and focus here on the European Union. So then we can see all the sourcing areas, and then we can highlight single companies if we are interested in. And once we start linking these imports to specifically places where these commodities are produced, we can then create a metric to look at to what extent these imports or these flows are associated with environmental impacts. So we created what we call deforestation exposure, in this case here for soy, and then we see where it's more likely that these companies are exposed to deforestation or exposed to being sourcing soy that was produced in recently deforested areas. So we give a metric, a number in hectares to the companies. We are not saying that these companies are responsible for the deforestation associated with that commodity, but rather it's an indicator of exposure. And we can see this also for countries of imports, such as the European Union. So we have, I showed here the example of soy, but we currently mapped 13 commodities, so including soy, palm oil, cocoa, coffee from different countries. And we tend to focus on providing this information or focusing on the commodities in countries where they are mostly linked to deforestation. So currently we map the trading of nearly 70% of the forest risk commodities that are linked to deforestation. So I'm going to go back here to the presentation, and I wanted to bring here 3 key messages on how these data sets can be used, especially for companies to assess the risks that they are exposed to and support the implementation of the EU regulation. So the first message is that this data and insights brings opportunities for targeted actions. And this is the case because we see that deforestation associated with exports tends to be highly concentrated in a few places. So in the case of soy imports from Brazil to the EU, we see that in 2020, 50% of all the EU deforestation exposure, or in other words, the likelihood of the EU being sourcing from areas that had been recently deforested directly for soy, is concentrated in only 13 municipalities, which represents 11% of all the exports to the EU. So we came from a very complex scenario where, a huge area in Brazil, where you start focusing to address half of the problem, you can start looking at 13 municipalities. And this is the same case for beef exports from Brazil, palm oil from Indonesia, and many other commodities from other countries. The second message here, and it's something that is really aligned with the new EU regulation, is this risk-based approach in which the EU regulation, and actually the EU Commission released today. So it's really linked to the question of Paolo that he put in the chat on this new risk benchmarking. So the EU Commission released today a tender for hiring companies or research institutes to develop this risk benchmarking approach in which countries will be categorizing different levels of risks. And here we present a sort of a methodological approach that could be used for this benchmarking system. And why is that? I mean, because it provides companies with a standardized and transparent approach to assess and compare the risk of commodity-driven deforestation across different regions. It really provides also a targeted strategy to risk mitigation, focusing and prioritizing efforts and resources on areas where deforestation are higher or more likely to occur. And it provides a more nuanced understanding of the risks associated with these commodities. And arguably also companies, when areas are identified as negligible risk or low risk, arguably companies could make claims of deforestation-free areas or volumes. So just touch basically quickly on the methodological framework that we developed and we will be publishing soon. And so the first step is that we map all the recent commodity deforestation for a given commodity that we are interested in. And then we use a sort of a benchmark to look at the different areas where there is commodity deforestation. And then the third step is to rank these sourcing areas by the amount of recent commodity deforestation. And then we apply a given threshold to classify the sourcing areas. And if needed, we also apply safeguards when necessary. So just to mention here briefly, one application that we did for soy using this framework of analysis, we mapped all the soy conversion for soy directly in 2020. And we saw here, and we applied a threshold in this case for 99% of all the conversion directly for soy. So here's the areas that we classified at risk. In this case, we used a very conservative approach because we are talking about a regulation, right? Talking about implementing a regulation or complying with a regulation. So we decided to apply a 99% of all the conversion, but we could reduce to 95, 90, according to the company or the consumer markets that wants to look at this. And then the other areas that don't fall within this threshold where the deforestation or conversion for soy happens, we classify them as negligible risk, where simplified due diligence will be in place in the case of the EU regulation. So this is the case here, applying for all the soy deforestation, right? Not looking for a specific supply chain from a company or from a country, but we can apply this methodology and then link to a specific supply chain. So a company can use their own sourcing areas and apply this framework. Or if they don't have any data on where they are sourcing from, because they don't have visibility of that supply chain, they can use trace data, for example, and then filter. In this case here, I applied this filter for the EU sourcing areas. So then you can filter just for the EU, where the EU source their soy from, and see where are the areas at risk or the areas of negligible risk where they can apply simplified due diligence. And just to mention that we've been engaging with the Consumer Goods Forum companies, and they are using this approach, or they suggested to use this approach in their new soy roadmap, in the element 1, in terms of managing their own supply chains, in which they recommend to use a credible methodology based on this, what we developed, to adopt a territorial approach to identify negligible risks origins in Brazil. And then going one step further and looking, and this is, I think it's a new frontier of development in terms of data and technology, is to really identify the areas of supply linked to specific companies' assets. For example, facilities, silos, mills, slaughterhouses, and so on. So using transaction information that we can gather through artificial intelligence, but also applying geospatial data, we can start mapping the areas where certain facilities sourcing from historically, and then create this what we call supply shed for certain areas. So for example, here we applied for soy in certain areas, in certain facilities, in this case silos and crushing facilities, and we identified where this silo mostly source their soy from. And then applying this framework of risk categorization, we can see, for example, we map the supply shed, and then we apply that, and then we can see which are the areas within the supply shed that fall into this category of negligible risk, or that are areas that are at risk, in which then we can categorize these facilities according to different levels of risk that can support companies, mostly downstream companies, to prioritize engagement with their suppliers and better understand their supply chain, and also come to their suppliers with more information to be able to ask more direct questions to understand and manage their risks. So just to wrap up here, the key points that I bring is, definitely I think it became clear in Noda's presentation here that the EU regulation is very unprecedented when it comes to all the commodities, and it will definitely bring challenges and will shape the dynamic of the supply chains. But we can definitely use data and insights to target actions, to possibly assess risks and prioritize actions by looking at sourcing regions based on this subnational approach. The risk benchmarking that I presented here is just a suggested methodological approach in line with best practices. We still need to see, the tender was released today by the European Commission. We still need to see how this will be implemented, but we put forward with partners a suggestion of methodological approach to really trying to move this forward with the best data that is available out there. And then, as I said, I think the next step with development frontiers will be, how can we develop systems to really identify risks at an asset level, in which financial institutions, companies and downstream companies mostly can better understand the risks they're exposed to and have more information in their hands to really target their actions in terms of engagement and actions to reduce their risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. And there is a question for you. How are you associating the forest cover change with the commodity in situations when there isn't a credible crop layer?
So I didn't touch base here in the methodology. but it's a bit complex, but I will try to summarize here. So we first need to map the supply chains. And for that, the backbone of our data sets is customs declaration or per shipment data that we link with many other different data sets in the country where we are mapping to, to go from the import country all the way from the production region. So that's the first step, which involves a hell of a lot of data. And the second part is then to map the deforestation. So in the case of Brazil here, we use data sets provided by the government, so official deforestation data sets. So we overlay these deforestation data sets with crop maps of this certain commodity. In the case of soy, we use data provided by researchers from the University of Maryland. In the case of beef, we use data from map biomas in Brazil that maps all the pastures in Brazil. So we overlay these two data sets, and then we have what we call the deforestation or the commodity deforestation, soy deforestation, beef deforestation, cocoa deforestation. So it's basically an overlap of these two maps. And then we have to allocate that to the supply chain actors. And the way we do that is simply by allocating according to the proportion of the volume that these supply chain actors source from specific regions. And that's why we can't say that these companies or consumer markets are responsible for that deforestation, but is rather a science-based and data-driven approach to identify where they are mostly exposed to risks.
Good, thank you very much, Andre. And there is also a question for Caroline and Ethan in the chat from Philip that you can answer directly in the chat. And then does your methodology, Andre, at this stage also take into account risk related to no compliance with national legislations or human rights violations, also like including indigenous people?
Very good question, Paolo. So at the moment, we only look in this data that I presented here, only look where the commodity is produced. And to comply with national regulations, we have to look at the farm level. That's a critical point to make here because the EU really require compliance with national regulations. And currently we are doing an assessment or an analysis in partnership with organizations in Brazil, with Imaflora and ICV, looking at to what extent soy exports to the EU are associated or are exposed to these risks of legality, most to illegal deforestation and compliance with the legal reserve. So we are doing this assessment now, and we will be publishing this analysis around August, September. But currently, we don't have any information on the website associated with those risks.
Thank you very much. And there is also a question from May on coffee, related to coffee. So I welcome the coffee expert to answer to May in the chat. Thank you. And now I will give the floor to my colleague Matthew McFall and we will go into the moderated exchange part.
Thanks, Greta, and thanks to all of our presenters today. As Greta mentioned, we're going to take this section of the webinar to do for moderated exchange, and it's a chance for everybody to put forth any questions or thoughts they have. But I first wanted to give Anna from ADM, who's the Director of Sustainability for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, a chance to speak about ADM's experience with traceability and traceability systems. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Matthew. So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Yeah, for who doesn't know, so IDM is the largest nutrition company. We are operating across the globe, bringing commodities from one place to another and processing them and producing the ingredients to sell into the market. So this is our main function. We don't own farmers, but at the end, what we do is we connect farmers with the manufacturers and then with the products that are at the end becoming on the shelf from the consumers. So from our experience related to the implementation of the regulation, I think it's important to mention that we have been working towards ending deforestation on all our supply chain. We have commitment already in place since 2008 with the initial Amazon soy moratorium. And then we have been working with farmers and with in different countries for the different commodities that we source in farm extension programs, and now more recently in regenerative agriculture to really support this transition for the green economy. So this is something that we have been experienced transforming those products, but also sharing with the information with farmers and technologies and providing them services to be able to produce products according to what the market is looking at. Today, when we look to the deforestation regulation itself and base it on the experience that we have and that we build over time regarding increasing traceability and those farmer support programs, we do face a challenge, especially when it comes to tackling really deforestation. Because at the end, when we look into the regulation itself, and it was explained already by the speakers in the precedent slide deck, the main ask is to have information from the plot of land where the product was produced, and also have a process in place to avoid mixing verified and unverified products. When it comes to the traceability information or the plot of land information, and if we consider the soy supply chain, soy is produced mainly in 2 countries. So in the US, we had 36 million hectares of soy production. And in Brazil, mainly we had 41 million hectares, according to the last values from USDA. We have been working in traceability or raising or increasing traceability information mainly on the high-risk areas following the risk-based approach. However, this is not enough for compliance with regulation because we will need also to increase traceability in the countries on the plot of land that there is no risk of deforestation today. So those 41 million hectares that we have in Brazil, we have been doing and a lot of work jointly with the other peer companies to understand the dynamic of deforestation and also the places where deforestation is happening. And we found that 3.5% of the deforestation is of the area of production, it's happening in deforestation. So from the total area that I mentioned, so 41 million hectares from Brazil, 3.5% have the deforestation since 2015. So even before the cutoff date of the deforestation regulation. But now we will need to also increase and have traceability from the areas that doesn't have risk of deforestation. And the risk that we see with that is that instead of addressing the challenge on ending and tackling deforestation of the country of origins or where it is happening, we will need to invest in new technologies to expand traceability information for all the products that we are also sourcing. And we see as a risk to divest from where needs to be focused today. In addition to that, when it comes to the segregation part, again, it's not written in the regulation as well, segregation, but it's written that we need to avoid mixing verified and unverified products. So the best way to do that today, following standards and protocols that are existing, is through a segregated supply chain. So instead of investing on farmers to tackle deforestation, we will need to invest in new capacities and new for being able to separate the products that we can verify and the ones that we cannot verify. similar case where in the places where there is no deforestation, like in the US today. So we will need to create infrastructure or additional infrastructure to just separate the products that we can track back to the farm and the ones that we cannot track back to the farm because we have other in the middle suppliers that can provide us the supply chain. So with that, we see a big challenge, especially when it comes to the managing of costs, because when we talk about commodity export and commodity trading, what is most important is the efficiency, and what lowers also the price that you have on the products, on the final products, is the efficiency of the logistic. Now that you need to create dedicated logistic for making products that will be EU compliant, you will need to also have those separate infrastructure to be able to meet with those requirements. And that will be a big challenge because it will change the way that today commodities trading and import and export is done. So I think and just to give an example on the size of the problem, not the problem, but the challenge in this case, when we're talking about one vessel includes 65,000 tons. And this 65,000 tons is coming from 20,000 hectares. And if we look in the total volume that Europe is consuming today on soy, including the different products, we might end with 12 million hectares of products that needs to be tracked back to the plot. So the information that needs to be provided will be huge, will be massive, and it needs to be processed in a way also that can provide the confidentiality information that, again, at the end, the farmers are, and the farmers, and also, again, the supply chains needs to keep. So I think this is also an important challenge, without even considering now the legal compliance, because this is, we need to find out also in each country of origin, how will be the best way, a more practical way to check legal compliance. So that's in the challenge side. When it comes to the opportunities, and again, I think we can build also on the experience that company have done or implemented over the past year. So we have been working in tackling deforestation, as I mentioned, since 2006 with the soy moratorium. That was the initial big agreement that we have as a company, also an exporter from Brazil, and then extending that across the different supply chains where we are. We have been also working with our peers, mainly under the Soft Commodities Forum, and also with the 1.5 agricultural sector roadmap to align our actions in a way that we can also harmonize the way that we are providing products into the market and ensure that from one side is tackling deforestation, but the other side is also aligning the emissions with what is expected on the 1.5 degree scenario. So I think there is a lot that can be built on. Inside the Soft Commodity Forum, we also shared, or we started an initiative called Farmer First Cluster, where we are looking for incentive for farmers that are allowed to open land, but they decide to not open land, and with that they can receive the incentives through restoration of different type of ecosystem that they have in the farm, or also avoiding deforestation. So I think these collective actions are the ones that will help us to address and tackle deforestation beyond that only provided information to fulfill the requirement from the regulation. And yeah, that's all from my side. Any question, happy to discuss with. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Anna. Very interesting point on the need to comply broadly out, not just in deforestation risk areas. So, okay, the floor is open for questions. So feel free to raise a hand, type it in the chat. We have about 10 minutes. I can go ahead and read some out that are coming up in the chat. From Philip. He's curious what quality control strategies are being developed to accurately connect volumes with the right sourcing areas. I don't know if anybody can tackle that one. Feel free to jump in.
I don't know if this is addressed to the data that I presented, or if it's more broad. But I mean, I can talk about the data that we have. I mean, we started mapping those commodities back in 2016, and when we really developed the approach. And since then, we've been, improving this by talking to companies, by talking to partners, by improving the quality of the data that is available. But it is a challenge indeed. I mean, we don't say that what we do, I mean, it is far from representing the reality, but we base on only the public information that is available out there to reconstruct the supply chain to bring transparency. And a few companies mentioned that sometimes it's not exactly accurate, but we are always happy to enter into discussions to see how we can improve this data set that we make available by trying to integrate data provided by companies and so on. So, but yeah, it's an important question that we try to solve in our case by using the best data that is available out there.
Thanks, Andre. Questions I see several in the chat for Ethan and Caroline that they're answering in the chat. Ethan or Caroline, I don't know if you wanted to perhaps mention or summarize perhaps your answers at all on the screen. That way, for those who maybe not being able to read the chat.
Sure. I'm also happy to address Suzanne's question. I was just responding, so I can do that verbally.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so Suzanne, yes, we're actually in the process of putting out a publication that's detailing the data set, the risk method, and the protocol behind it all. So that will be in the public domain shortly, and we'd love for others to take a look at it and see what would be helpful, and happy to have a follow-up discussion soon on that. It is an interesting point you make, right? That how do you build trust? Given, cocoa sector perhaps has fewer countries and players than something like the coffee sector. And I'm curious to hear Ethan's thoughts here, but I think what it really boiled down to was finding a collective of the leading players that saw the common goal, business case, I would say, and how this would make it more efficient to work together, and really finding that initial group and then growing it. So, we mentioned we got 19 companies to sign up. It started with like 6, and it kind of blossomed. And so I think, if you can find those leaders, build the trust and then see it blossom, that was something we were actually shocked when 19 signed. To be honest, Ethan and I almost fell off our chairs and, had a celebratory moment there. Just the trust we were able to build. So that would be just one, I know, just basic recommendation I could give, but Ethan, you might have more thoughts just on how the CFI was set up and recommendations from your perspective.
I mean, just to build off of what Caroline is saying, I would say that you even go further and leverage the work that we've done in the cocoa sector to build this trust, to create the data set, to set an example for other sectors. I mean, even in the work that we started doing in the cocoa sector, working with WRI, we based a lot of that off of work that WRI had done in the palm oil sector to create like an aligned DRA methodology, right? So we built on previous work and previous collaboration, and hopefully we're kind of setting the example of what could happen, not just within the data set, but within like the entire collaboration on the Cocoa and Forest Initiative. But hopefully this kind of sets the stage for what could happen in soy, what could happen in coffee, what could happen in rubber, what could happen in other commodities. And then there was just another question. And so hopefully Caroline, hopefully there's a lot that we can write about this in the future that can kind of set this this messaging and communication going forward. There was another question that came up is, well, how do you address traceability in the indirect supply chain and from those smaller actors within the supply chain that are the traceability that's not necessarily covered by the direct supply chains of the Cargills and Mars and Nestle's and Barry Callebaut's out there. And to respond to that, that's where so much of our work at the World Cocoa Foundation with the companies is also focused on working directly with the producing governments. Obviously in line with the EUDR, but working with the governments to establish national level traceability systems that incorporates the entire cocoa supply chain to improve traceability down to the farm level. Working on the national traceability system, but then at least initially focusing on full supply chain traceability within these priority landscapes that we were talking about.
Great, thanks, Ethan, Caroline. Building on that a little bit, curious if any of our speakers could speak to perhaps Andre Trace or Caroline, either way, the working with the national governments around either them enabling data sharing and collection or being able to utilize the data that they do collect and share publicly. I'm just curious what the relationships are like, if any challenges, lessons learned in kind of interfacing with the governments in that space.
I'm going to punt this one over to Ethan, and then I can add some tidbits from our perspective.
Audio kicked out there for a second. Please repeat that one more time.
Yes, it's just really about challenges, lessons learned related to the national governments, interacting with them on the data collection, data sharing, and them enabling some of the data gathering through their public infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, everything that we've been doing on developing, if we're just focused on the development of the data set itself, everything that we've been doing with the development of the West Africa cocoa farm data set, so these million polygons that the company supplied, it was very important that we engaged with the governments from the very beginning, that we were working on this work, and that we have the ambition to use the collaboration that we have now on the data set, but then ideally future collaborations as we work to update the data set, that we're actually able to utilize this to support and contribute to the national level traceability systems, just as we were talking about, and deforestation monitoring as well. One of the key areas of focus that we need to address, and Caroline brought this up a little bit in her challenges and opportunities portion, is the fact that one of the areas that we're most concerned about is the safeguards for the farmers who are implicated in the data that's being shared. So we are still working through those aspects with the governments, but our intention, our hope, is that in the future we're able to contribute to national level traceability and deforestation monitoring with the development of the data set, once we're able to ensure that farmers would not be negatively impacted with any type of sharing of this type of data.
Great, thanks, Ethan. Go ahead.
So just to add from our perspective, I think this is key, and I fully agree with what Ethan just said. But I think this question also speaks to Daisy's questions that she put on the chat about, producing countries creating their own traceability systems. I mean, it really, from our experience, it really vary from country to country, the transparency and level of information that they made available. But also, from the same country, the different governments. For example, in Brazil, in the last 4 years, we really had a difficult time to engage with the government, and actually it went to the opposite direction. So sources of information that we used to use to build our maps actually were not available anymore. So it decreased the level of transparency. But ideally, we would link the data that we made available with traceability national systems. and this, we are seeing this being developed in the case of Brazil and in other countries, and that's exactly what we would like to see more, and therefore then connect these data sets with the shipment data to then link to import countries.
Great, thanks, Andre. Any other questions before we wrap up? We are close to time.
There is Chloe who has her hand up. Please, Chloe.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. It's not an intervention. Hang on, let me. Okay, yeah, I have a question for Caroline and Ethan. I was just thinking, it's so great to have this kind of centralized data set of farmers, and so I see your huge work in doing this for deforestation risk assessments. I was trying to consider whether there's another application possible in the kind of data integrity measures for the traceability systems. Let me try to put it simply. Companies right now, we know in Ivory Coast there's a lot of deforestation happening in protected area. That's still happening, and somehow this cocoa finds its way into global supply chains, including fueling into supply chains where there's digital systems in place to collect information. And so one of the blind spots I see currently with all these traceability systems is that companies have done a huge farmer mapping, and then they have those elaborate systems where they calculated average yield and they make sure that they're not sourcing more than what the farmers could produce. But then if they sell to different cooperatives and it gets to different supply chain, different digital systems, then you never compile and cross-reference that this geolocated farmer has actually supplied like 3 times his yield into different supply chains and different systems. So is there any application with the huge work you've done so that this kind of cross-check could be done? It could even be anonymously, like one exporter does not need to know who else, it just needs to know that, oh, this farmer has actually supplied information to other traders, and then that rings an alert. And so I was just wondering if you're exploring this idea too of enhancing the quality of data that is fueled into those traceability systems.
Boy, that is a really good question. And I would say that as we are from the WCF perspective, right? So as we're building, we continue to build the trust of the companies as we're setting standards around what we mean by traceability, which is quite rigorous. With every single plot being polygon mapped, for example, as we're building that trust and collaboration on developing the data set, and as we're working with the companies and with the governments to build alignment on traceability, we do have future ambitions, and we do have a future vision of what an aligned traceability system could potentially look like for the cocoa sector. So all of those aspects that you're talking about, where there's more transparent communication, where there's alert systems, where we're actually able to trace that cocoa throughout the entire supply chain for many different reasons, that is and it touches both the direct and the indirect supply chain. Those are certainly key aspects of a future vision of what we're striving for within the cocoa sector.
And I'll just add a little flavor to this. So we mentioned how this data is being used to identify collaboration opportunities amongst these 19 cocoa and chocolate companies. And there are certainly many instances where the same company or many are sourcing from the same plot. Okay, so this is a known, right? So now we know where. But again, bringing back in the farmer view, what do we do when that happens in a way that's puts the farmer up front and center? I think that's what we need to figure out as well as we go down this journey before we start taking action. So I think, we had some specific things about what we would and wouldn't do in that data sharing agreement I mentioned when we note these plots, for example, because that's where it becomes sensitive. You get into potential antitrust, and really it's the ethical piece of it. So we need to find a way to tackle this challenge in a way that puts farmers first. But we are doing a bit of that already through this project, sort of starting to think through those challenges.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for all of your questions and speakers to the great answers. I think if I were to sum up a theme in one theme, it would be the emphasis on smallholder, ensuring that this regulation is supportive, not burdensome, and also safeguarding their livelihoods and privacy concerns through all these traceability systems. So I'll send it over to Greta to wrap up.
Thank you, Matthew, and thanks everyone for participating, and also to the speakers. Before leaving, my colleagues Federica and Carolina Carlotta, sorry, will post now a link to a survey. Please take 3 minutes to complete this survey. This will be very useful to us to design further sessions. And also please join our FACS community. In there you will find more resources, as well as you will have the opportunity to connect with all of us and also other practitioners. So thank you very much again for all of you for your participation, and we look forward for seeing you in further future sessions. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.